My name is Nora Calvert. I was 58 years old the night my family stood up at a dinner I had paid for and told a room full of people that I had never really been one of them. My mother did it between the salad and the entree. She tapped her water glass with a butter knife, the way she used to call a church committee to order. She said some things needed to be said plainly in front of everyone, so there would be no confusion later. Then she looked at me. Not with anger. Anger would have been easier. She looked at me the way you look at a coat you've decided to give away. Nora was never really ours, she said. Not by blood. We took her in and we did our best. But she isn't a Calvert. It's time this family stopped pretending otherwise. My sister nodded. My sister's husband studied his napkin. 30 people I had known my whole life looked down at their plates. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up and shout. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate very gently so it wouldn't make a sound. And I let the silence sit there for almost a full minute. Here is what none of them knew. 8 months before that dinner, a letter had found me. My birth family had been looking for me for 30 years. And that night, the night my mother chose to announce that I didn't belong, 3 of them were sitting at a table by the window. 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She simply hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is the reason I can tell you this today. 6 years later. Steady voice. My hands folded on my own kitchen table, in my own house. Now let me take you back. Not 8 months, almost 50 years. To the first time I understood that I was the one who paid. I was 9 years old the first time I understood how our family did its math. My sister Bree was 7. She wanted a bicycle, a red one with a white banana seat that sat in the window of Handel's Hardware on Main Street in Corwin, Ohio. My mother, Marlene, told her she'd have it by her birthday. And she did. It was leaning against the porch rail on the morning of Bree's birthday, with a bow on the handlebars. That same month, my shoes had a hole worn clean through the left sole. When I told my mother, she said money didn't grow on trees. She said I could fold an index card and put it inside the shoe until the weather turned. So I did. When it rained, the card went to mush by lunchtime, and I learned to walk on the outside edge of my foot to keep the wet part off my sock. I didn't think it was cruelty. I thought it was arithmetic. Bree was theirs. I was the one they'd taken in. And what was taken in got what was left over, after the real children were taken care of. If you've ever felt like a guest in your own family, hit like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. There's a new confession here every day. I'd like to know who's out there in the quiet with me. There were 100 small versions of it. 1 cupcake at the bake sale, never 2. Hand-me-downs that came to me with the return tags from Bree's newer things still stapled on. In winter, my mother turned the heat down in my room first, and only mine. You're the tough one, Nora. You don't feel the cold like Bree does. I wasn't tough. I was cold. I just learned not to say so, because saying so cost me something I couldn't spare. I was adopted as an infant. I always knew that much. It was never a secret. What I didn't know was that "we adopted her" in my mother's mouth wasn't the start of a love story. It was a thing she seemed to regret a little more every year. There was one person who didn't do the math. My grandmother, my adoptive father's mother, everyone called her Nan. At Nan's house, there was no tough one and no real one. There was just Nora, who liked her toast cut into triangles and got to stay up too late. Nan is the reason I know what it feels like to be wanted for no reason at all. That mattered later, because it meant I could recognize the real thing when it finally came looking for me. Nan died when I was 23. I gave the eulogy. I was the only one who talked about who she was instead of what she left behind. Within a month of the funeral, my parents sold their cramped split level and moved into Nan's bigger house on Linden Road. I helped them pack. Of course I did. So I did what I'd learned to do. I made myself useful. I became the one who was good in a crisis, because a crisis was the one time the family needed me and couldn't pretend they didn't. When my father's knees gave out and he couldn't manage the stairs, I moved in for 4 months to help. Bree sent a fruit basket with a card that said, "Thinking of you both." When Bree's first husband left her with 2 kids and a mortgage, I covered the mortgage. Not once, 6 times over 2 years until she found her feet. When the roof on Linden Road failed and the insurance wouldn't pay, I paid. I kept the receipts. I keep receipts for everything. It's a manager's habit, and it turned out to matter, so hold on to that. I never resented it while I was doing it. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who didn't grow up this way. I was grateful to be needed. Being needed was the closest thing to belonging anyone offered me, and I took it, gladly, for 50 years. I managed the cafeteria at Corwin Elementary for 26 of those years. It's not glamorous. You're up before the sun, you plan around allergies and the price of ground beef, and the one child every year who comes to school hungry and whose family you quietly make sure never finds out you noticed. It taught me something that mattered more than anything my mother taught me. You can love people by feeding them and never saying a word about it. You can take care of a whole room of people who will never know your name. That was who I was before the letter came. A woman who had stopped expecting the bicycle, who had folded the index card into her shoe so many times she'd forgotten there was ever a hole. And then, on a gray Tuesday in March, a letter came. It was on cream-colored paper, heavier than the bills. The return address was a town in Kentucky I had never heard of. My name, Nora, was written in a looping, old-fashioned hand, the kind they don't teach anymore. I almost didn't open it. I thought it was one of those genealogy companies, the ones that send you a leaf and want your credit card. I set it on the counter and made my tea and let it sit there for 2 days. The way you circle a phone call you're afraid to make. When I finally opened it, I read it standing up at the kitchen counter. I had to put my hand flat on the counter to stay steady. It was from a woman named Della. She wrote that she was my birth mother's younger sister, my aunt. She wrote that my birth mother, Ruth, had died 2 years earlier, and that before she died, Ruth had made Della promise to keep looking. She wrote that Ruth had been 17 when she had me, that she had not given me up so much as had me taken by parents of her own who decided for her. That Ruth had spent 30 years believing she was not allowed to look for the daughter whose birthdays she never stopped counting. And then Della wrote a sentence I have read so many times the paper has gone soft at the fold. Ruth left you something, and she asked me to put it in your hand myself, not the mail. She said you'd been handed enough things across tables in your life, and she wanted this one done right. I want to tell you I called immediately. I didn't. I was 58 years old, and I had learned in a very deep place not to reach for things, because reaching is how you learn what you're not allowed to have. I put the letter in a drawer. I took it out. I put it back. It took me 9 days to call. When I did, a voice answered that sounded so much like a voice I didn't know I'd been listening for my whole life, that I sat down on the kitchen floor, with my back against the cabinet, and stayed there for an hour, while a stranger who was not a stranger told me about my mother. Over the next 6 months, I drove to Kentucky 4 times. The first time, I almost turned around twice on the highway. I had a whole speech ready about how I didn't want anything from them, in case that's what they were worried about, that a stranger would show up wanting money. That's the reflex 50 years builds. You walk into every door braced to prove you're not a burden. Della met me on her porch. She was 71, sharp as a tack, and she laughed with her whole face. Before I could get my careful speech out, she took my face in both her hands and just looked at me for a long moment. "Lord," she finally said, You've got Ruth's eyebrows, and you're standing there like you're about to apologize for the weather. She used to do that too. And then she pulled me inside and fed me, and I understood something in that first hour that took me months to actually believe. These people were not going to charge me for the seat. I met Della's daughter, Pearl, and Pearl's 2 children. On that first visit, Pearl set a place for me at the table without asking whether I'd stay for supper. She just put down a 5th plate, the way you do for family, and slid the good chair, the one with the arms, toward me. I sat in it and I couldn't finish my food, because I was busy memorizing the fact that someone had assumed I'd eat. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it's the engine of everything that came later. All through those months in Kentucky, there was a date circled in my mind that I never mentioned to Della. My mother's 80th birthday. Because even while these people were setting me a place without being asked, I knew that in the spring I would go home and sit in the seat by the door where the waiter's cart comes through and pay for a party and be grateful for it. I had 2 families now, one that made room for me for free and one that charged me for the chair. And I hadn't yet let myself understand that I was going to have to choose. On the second visit, Della showed me the photographs. She had a shoebox of them, soft at the corners. I saw Ruth for the first time, a thin young woman with my exact eyebrows, standing in front of a church in a dress she'd clearly sewn herself, squinting into the sun and not quite smiling. There was another one, Ruth at maybe 40, in an apron behind a diner counter, caught mid-laugh with a coffee pot in her hand. Della touched that one and said, "That's the one you should have. That's who she was on a good day." I have it framed now in my hallway. It's the first face I see when I come home. The third visit was the pin. I'll come to the pin. The fourth, I stayed 2 nights, and on the second night I couldn't sleep. I came downstairs at 2 a.m, and Della was already at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee poured, like she'd been waiting. She hadn't been. "I heard the stair creak," she said. "Sit down." And I told her, finally, about the party I was going to throw in the spring, and how I always paid, and how I didn't know how to stop. Della didn't tell me to stop. She just said, "When the time comes, you'll know what you need. And wherever you need us to be, we'll be there." I didn't understand yet that I was already deciding. I learned things about myself on those long drives home that rearranged me from the inside. The way I hum without knowing I'm doing it, Ruth did that. She had fed people for a living, too. She'd cooked at a diner off a state highway for 30 years, and Della said the regulars came as much for Ruth as for the pie. I had spent my whole life thinking I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong family. It turned out I was exactly like a woman I'd never met, a woman who had counted my birthdays from 400 miles away. I'll be honest about the ugly part, because this channel is not for pretending. In those 6 months, I tested them. The way a dog that's been kicked flinches at a raised hand, even a kind one. I'd cancel a visit at the last minute to see if they'd punish me. They didn't. They'd just say, "Next time, honey, drive safe." Once I offered to pay for a family dinner, my old reflex, make yourself useful, earn the seat. Della put her hand flat on the check and looked at me. "You don't buy your way in at this table," she said. "It was bought before you were born. It's been sitting empty this whole time, waiting for you." I didn't know what to do with that. I had no framework for being wanted for nothing. It was like being handed a language I'd been told all my life I was too slow to learn. The thing Ruth left me was small. Della gave it to me on my 3rd visit, wrapped in a handkerchief, that still smelled faintly of a kitchen. It was a lapel pin, an enamel forget-me-not, the kind of cheap, pretty thing a girl in the 1960s might have saved up for. The blue paint had worn off one of the petals. The clasp on the back was bent, so it never sat quite straight. Ruth had worn it every day of her life, Della said, at the diner, to church, in the hospital at the end. She'd told Della, "When you find her, this goes to her. It's the only thing I ever owned that was really mine. And she's the only person I ever made who was really mine. So they belong together." I pinned it to my coat that day, crooked because the clasp was bent. I have worn it crooked ever since. I want you to remember that pin. It comes back. While all of this was happening in Kentucky, something else was happening in Corwin. My mother was turning 80, and Bree decided there should be a party. When I say Bree decided, I mean Bree announced. Bree has never in her life organized a thing. She wasn't going to be photographed at. She calls me when she needs something, the way you'd flip a light switch. Mom's 80th had to be special, she said. A real dinner, a private room, the good restaurant out on the county road, the one with the white tablecloths. Then she got to the part she'd called for. "Money's tight for me right now, Nor. You know how it is. But you always come through. Mom would love it if you handled it." I handled it. Of course I handled it. I want you to sit with how automatic it was, because it's the whole story. My sister told me to pay for a party celebrating the mother who had folded an index card into my shoe. And my first feeling was not resentment. It was relief. Relief that I was still useful. Relief that there was still a seat, even if I had to buy it. I booked the private room at the Ellery House. I chose the menu. I know menus, it's my life's work. I sat at my own kitchen table with the caterer's sheet, and I did what I do best, which is plan a meal for people who will never think about who planned it. The salmon, because my mother likes to be seen ordering salmon. A vegetarian option, because Bree's daughter had gone vegetarian and would make a scene if there wasn't one. I made sure they'd do a proper cake, a real one, 3 layers, not the sheet cake with the plastic rose. I paid the deposit. Then, 3 weeks later, I paid the balance. The total came to just shy of $4,000, which is a great deal of money for a woman who plans meals around the price of ground beef. I remember writing that check at my kitchen table. I remember the little pause my hand made before I signed it. And I remember what I told myself, because it's the sentence that had run my whole life. This is how you stay in it. This is the cost of the seat. I signed it. I always signed it. And here is the decision that changed everything. When the restaurant asked how many and whether I wanted the long table by the window or just the private room, I did something I had never done in my life. I kept the window table. And I booked it under my own name. Because 8 months into knowing my birth family, I had made a phone call I almost didn't make. I called Della, and I stood in my kitchen, turning the cord in my fingers like a girl, and I asked her, I could barely get it out, if she and Pearl and the 2 kids might come to Ohio the weekend of my mother's party. There was a silence on the line, and then Della said, careful and gentle, "To the party, honey?" "No," I said, too fast. "No, just to be in town, not to the party." I can't do that, and I ran out of words, because I didn't have the words yet for what I was asking. And Della, who understood me better after 8 months than my mother had after 50 years, said, "We'll come. We'll be wherever you need us to be, and we won't say a word until you say so. You just tell us where to sit." She didn't ask me to explain. She'd figured out, before I had, that I was asking her to catch me. I wasn't brave enough for the party itself, I told myself, just to be in the same town, just so that, on the hardest night of the year, the night I performed Being a Calvert one more time, there would be, 3 tables away, a family that had driven 400 miles for no reason except that I'd asked. I told myself it was for comfort. I told myself they'd sit quietly, and I'd know they were there, and it would give me the strength to get through my mother's night. I did not let myself know then what I was really doing. I only understood it later. I was setting a table of my own. For the first time in my life, I was the one who decided who sat where. The night of the party, it snowed lightly. The kind of March snow that doesn't stick. I got to the Ellery house an hour early to check the room, because that's who I am. The long window table was set for 4, off to the side. I'd told the staff those guests were mine, and to treat them like the president was coming. The main table, the one under the good light, was set for the family. I'd placed the cards myself. My mother at the head, Bree at her right, Bree's husband Aaron, the cousins, and me, at the far end, in the seat by the door where the waiter's cart comes through, which is where I had sat at every family gathering for 50 years, and which I had set for myself out of a habit so old it felt like gravity. The family arrived in a cluster of coats and noise. My mother wore the gray wool she saved for funerals and important occasions, and she looked, I'll give her this, magnificent. 80 years old and straight as a fence post, receiving her guests like a queen who had never once doubted the throne was hers. Della and her family came in quietly at 6:45 and took the window table. Della caught my eye across the room. She did not wave. She did not make a fuss. She just put her hand flat on her own chest over her heart and held it there for a moment. I had to turn and pretend to check the wine. Dinner started fine. That's the part people don't expect. For the first hour, it was an ordinary family dinner. Toasts, old stories, my mother holding court. I let myself relax an inch. I thought, I'll get through this. And then I'll go sit with Della for 10 minutes before they drive back to the motel. And that will be my real evening. Then, between the salad and the entree, my mother tapped her glass with a butter knife. She said there was something the family needed to hear. Plainly. While everyone was together. So there'd be no confusion down the road. She talked, at first, about legacy, about what it means to be a Calvert, about how she'd been thinking a great deal at 80, about how things should be arranged, and about who her people really were. I still didn't see it coming. I thought she was going to announce her will the way some people announce a cruise. I even thought, God help me. I still had this reflex at 58. I thought maybe she was going to thank me. Maybe there'd be a sentence at the end about how Nora always came through. Instead, she set her glass down with the precision of a woman who has practiced. And she said, I've decided to make some changes to my estate, and I want everyone to understand the reasoning. Family is blood. I've come to believe that at my age. Nora has been a help to us over the years, no one's denying that. But she was never actually ours, not by blood. And it isn't right to divide what belongs to my real children with someone who was, when you come down to it, a kindness we did a long time ago. Nora, I hope you'll understand. It's just time we all stopped pretending. There it was. 50 years, said out loud. In a private room with white tablecloths that I had paid for, in front of 30 people who were, at that moment, eating my food. Bree nodded, slowly, like a woman agreeing with a sermon. Aaron looked at his napkin. Down the table, a cousin let out a small, nervous laugh, and then swallowed it. And I did not cry. I want to tell you what happened inside me instead, because it wasn't what I would have guessed. I'd spent 50 years braced for this exact sentence, the one that made the arithmetic official. And now that it had finally arrived, the thing I felt was not the floor dropping out. It was the floor arriving. It was solid ground. Because for the first time, the lie was over. She had said the true thing at last, and a true cruel thing is at least something you can stand on. I set my fork down on the edge of my plate, gently, so it wouldn't make a sound. And I let the silence sit there for almost a full minute, while my mother waited for me to do what I had always done. Absorb it. Smooth it over. Apologize for the awkwardness of my own existence. And pass the bread. If you've ever sat at a table and understood in one clean second that the people looking at you were never going to change, and that the only thing left to change was you, type the word table in the comments below. I know a lot of you are out there. Stay with me. The part you came for is about to happen. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip the way my mother had. I set it down. "Mom," I said. My voice was very calm. "The cafeteria teaches you that. You do not raise your voice in a room full of 8-year-olds. You lower it, and they lean in. Thank you for finally saying it out loud. I've waited about 50 years for someone in this family to be honest. It turns out you had it in you all along." Her face flickered. This was not the script. "I want to be honest back," I said, "so I'm going to tell you 3 true things. And then I'm going to leave. And after tonight, you won't have to pretend about me anymore. I think that'll be a relief for all of us." "Nora," Bree started, in the voice she uses to manage me, "this isn't the first true thing." I didn't raise my voice, and Bree stopped talking, which surprised us both. "This dinner, this room, that cake, I paid for all of it, $4,000. I paid for the party where I was uninvited from the family. I want you to remember that, Bree. The next time you tell someone, I always come through." The room had gone very still. "The second true thing." I reached down beside my chair and lifted the folder. I'd brought it out of habit. I bring a folder everywhere, it's a manager's reflex. I hadn't planned to open it. I opened it. For 30 years, this family called me when the roof leaked, when the mortgage was due, when Dad couldn't do the stairs. I have the records, because I'm the kind of person who keeps records. It comes to a little over $60,000 over the years. I never asked for a cent of it back. I'm not asking now. I only want it said, once, out loud, the way you said your thing out loud. I was never your kindness. I was your safety net. And you're about to find out what a house feels like when the net decides to go home. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air, where a reasonable daughter's apology should have been. "Sit down," she said. "You're making a scene." "No," I said. "For the first time in my life, I'm leaving one." And then I did the thing I had not planned. The thing I did not know I'd been building toward for 8 months, when I booked a window table under my own name. I stood up. Not dramatically. The way you rise from any table, a woman pushing her chair back, gathering her coat. And I turned, and I walked past my mother's chair, past the cousins, past 30 people holding their breath, 3 tables back, to the window, where Della stood up to meet me, and her daughter stood. And the 2 kids, who didn't fully understand what was happening, but understood that their people were standing, stood too. My mother turned around in her chair at last, and she saw them. 4 strangers, rising at a table by the window, reaching for me. A family she had never seen, standing up for a daughter she had just given away. In the same breath she'd given her away in. "Who are these people?" my mother said. And for the first time all night, her voice was not certain. I put my hand on Della's shoulder. Della put her hand over mine, and I turned back to face the room. "This," I said, "is the 3rd true thing. 8 months ago, my mother's family found me. My real mother, the one who had me at 17 and was never allowed to look, spent 30 years counting my birthdays. She died before we found each other. But she left instructions, and she left me this." I touched the crooked little pin on my coat. "You spent 50 years deciding I didn't belong to you. And you were right. I never did. I belonged to her the whole time. I just hadn't been allowed to know it." I'd like to tell you my mother crumbled, or apologized, or that something in her cracked open. This channel doesn't traffic in the endings we wish for. What she did was reach for the only weapon she had left. "Well," she said, and her voice found its edge again, "isn't that convenient? Some deathbed relative crawls out of the woodwork the same year I decide to fix my will. I hope they know what they're getting. She'll bleed them dry the way she... Marlene. Della's voice cut across the room, warm and absolutely immovable. The voice of a woman who had raised children and buried a sister and was not remotely afraid of a woman in gray wool. I knew Nora's mother. Ruth Halloran was the finest woman I ever met. She cooked for strangers for 30 years and never once made a single one of them feel like a charity case at her counter. She let that land. I can see that's a thing your family never learned how to do. And here is the part I could not have written. The part that made the whole room understand at once. My mother, 80 years old in her funeral wool, at the head of the table, started shouting. About money. About ingratitude. About how dare I, after everything, embarrass her in front of everyone at her own party. And there is not a person alive who watches a parent stand up and scream about money at their own birthday dinner and thinks, ah, yes, there's the real family. My father, the man I'd called Dad for 58 years, Frank, who had sat silent through all of it, did not stand up. He put his face in his hands. I think, at the very end, some small, honest part of him knew. I let my mother run out of words the way a storm runs out of rain. And when the quiet came back, I did one last thing. I walked the 3 tables back to the front, and I set a single page down on the white tablecloth, beside my mother's plate. You'll want to give this to your attorney, I said. It's from mine. She looked at it like it might bite her. What is it? It's me, I said, resigning. 2 weeks ago, in writing, I gave up any claim on your estate. Every penny. Whatever you were planning to announce tonight, the changes, the reasons, the blood, you're about 14 days too late. There was nothing left to take from me. I'd already handed it back. I didn't tell her the rest that night. I didn't tell her that the family I'd found had been keeping a place for me my whole life, and that it turned out to be a real place, with my name on it, older than her cruelty and untouched by it. That part she never earned the right to hear. I just picked up my coat and I walked back to the window, to the table I had set myself, and I sat down in the chair Pearl had saved, and for the first time in 58 years, I ate a family dinner as a guest of no one. So let me tell you what came after. 3 things, really, and I'll give you all of them. The practical, the painful, and the one that healed. The practical first. My mother took the letter to her attorney exactly as I'd suggested. I know how that meeting went, more or less, because the attorney was a man named Halverson, who'd done work for half of Corwin and small towns Leek. He read my attorney's letter, and then he had to explain to my mother that there was nothing to fix. That you cannot disinherit someone who has already legally, in writing, disclaimed any interest in your estate. That I had, in the eyes of the law, resigned from the Calvert family 2 weeks before she stood up to fire me from it. The whole performance at the Ellery house, the butter knife, the speech about blood, the 30 witnesses, had accomplished precisely nothing, except that it had been done in front of 30 witnesses. And here's the part that turned. Halverson, I'm told, asked my mother a question that had never once occurred to her to ask. He asked how the household expenses had been covered these last 30 years. The roof, the furnace, the tax shortfalls. Because he was trying to understand what her actual estate looked like now that she was declaring her intentions. And my mother had no good answer, because the answer was me. For 30 years, the answer had been me. And I'll tell you the other half plainly, and then leave it alone. Because it isn't what the story is about. The family I found had not come to me empty-handed. My birth grandmother had spent the last year of her life quietly setting aside what she could, so that when I was finally found, there'd be something waiting that was mine before I ever knew my own name. It came to more than I'll ever spend, and I have never touched $1 of it. I didn't need the money. I needed to know that somewhere, for 30 years, a place had been kept for me on purpose. That was the whole inheritance as far as I'm concerned. The rest is just numbers. Now the social thing, because this is what actually happened to my mother. 30 people were in that room. 30 people watched an 80-year-old woman stand up at her own birthday, announce that the daughter who'd paid for the evening was never really hers, and then start shouting about money when it went wrong. You cannot unring that. In a town the size of Corwin, that dinner is still what people mean when they say my mother's name. She won the will. She lost the room. And in her world, the room was everything. Bree, I later learned, had been counting on my share redistributing to her. She had already, apparently, mentioned to her husband what they'd do with it. She did not get a larger slice of a smaller pie. She got a mother who now needed a new roof and a new furnace, and a woman to call when the property taxes came due, and no one to call because the woman they always called had, as promised, gone home. The last I heard, Bree pays for those things now. She learned what a roof costs. She learned what a furnace costs. She learned, I imagine, exactly what I had been quietly absorbing for 3 decades, while she gave away cupcakes for the pleasure of it. I feel a complicated, quiet thing about that. Not quite satisfaction, not quite sorrow. I feel like a woman who set down a weight after 50 years and stood up straight for the first time and watched someone else bend to pick it up and finally understand what it weighed. The painful thing. There's my father, Frank, the man I called Dad for 58 years. He never said a word at that dinner. He put his face in his hands and left it there. But a month later he called me, once. He didn't apologize. He wasn't built for it. What he said was, "I always knew what she was doing to you. I just never had the spine to stop her." And then he went quiet, and then he hung up. That was the closest thing to sorry I ever got from that house, and I've decided it counts for something, because at least it was true. And there's my nephew, Bree's son Cody, who was 12 at that dinner. When the shouting started, he got up from the family table, walked the length of the room, and sat down at the window table next to me. His mother told him to come back. He shook his head, looked at his plate, and stayed. He's 19 now. He calls me on Sundays. His mother and I don't speak, and I've made my peace with the fact that we probably never will. But I didn't lose everyone. And I'll be honest, it still hurts, in a low place, that I lost as many as I did. Boundaries aren't free. Anyone who tells you they walked away clean is telling you a story. I walked away whole, which is different and better, and not the same as clean, and the thing that healed. Della is 77 now. I drive to Kentucky 1 weekend a month. Last spring, I stayed for 2 weeks and helped her put in a garden, and one evening we sat on her porch, and she took my face in her hands the way, she told me, Ruth used to do. And she said, "There she is." Just that. There she is. As if I'd been late arriving for 58 years, and the table had been set the whole time. I keep Ruth's pin on my coat. Crooked, I've never fixed the clasp. A jeweler offered to once, and I said no. The crookedness is the point. It's the one thing in my life that was given to me by someone who wanted nothing back. I'd sooner wear it wrong than pretend it was ever anything other than exactly what it is. So that's the story. 50 years of folding an index card into my shoe. 1 letter on cream-colored paper. A window table I booked under my own name before I understood why. And a woman I never met who counted my birthdays from 400 miles away and left me the only thing she ever owned that was really hers. If you've ever been the useful one, the one who pays, who shows up, who holds it together, who learned to be grateful for a small place because a small place felt safer than asking for more, I want you to hear this from someone who lived it for 58 years. You do not have to buy your way in. The people who are really yours won't hand you a bill for the chair. You are not extra. You were never the kindness someone did a long time ago. And if the family that raised you can't see that, it's a failure of their eyes, not your worth. So set your own table. Decide who sits where. And when someone finally takes your face in their hands and says, "There she is," let them. You've kept them waiting long enough. Take care of your own house. Take care of yourself. There's a new confession here every day, and I'll see you in the next one.